Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're tackling a massive topic: the global struggle to escape poverty, viewed through the lens of Ali Alawi's compelling book, Rich World, Poor World.
Yeah, it's quite a book.
It really is. This isn't just history, it's a deep dive into how the world economic order came to be and the incredibly complex, often frustrating paths countries outside the traditional Western powers have navigated trying to, well, catch up or chart their own course.
That's right. Our mission today is really to pull out the most critical insights from this sprawling history. We want to understand the roots of global inequality, how the very language we use to talk about development has shifted.
That's fascinating in itself.
It is.
Yeah.
And how radically different ideas and, external forces have shaped national destinies. Think of it as maybe a crash course in the evolution of the global economy and the powerful currents countries have had to swim against.
Exactly. We'll go from the very origins of the concept of development, look at early, sometimes, let's say, self-serving aid efforts, see how global crises forced radical shifts, examine the rise of powerful new institutions and competing ideologies from state planning to free markets, and finally, grapple with the persistent inequalities we still see today. Okay, let's unpack this history.
So where does this story really begin in the modern context? Ollie places a lot of emphasis on the post-WWII era, the concept of development. It isn't some timeless ideal. It really emerged when the world suddenly had a clear standard bearer, the U.S. and a recovering Europe.
Right, these were the developed nations, and everyone else was, well, by definition, measured against them.
And the language reflected that. It's fascinating how the terms evolved. Before the Cold War, you might hear backward nations. A bit harsh.
Very harsh.
Then it shifted to underdeveloped, which sounds maybe a little less judgmental, then less developed, and finally developing.
Those later terms definitely attempted to strip away some of the value judgment,
Right.
Suggesting a potential for growth.
They tried. But the underlying assumption, it kind of remained the West was the model. And then, as the Cold War really solidified, the idea of the Third World emerged.
Ah, yes, the Third World.
Countries trying to navigate a path that was neither aligned with the First World West nor the Second World Soviet bloc.
Right, trying to find that non-aligned space, which must have been incredibly difficult given the pressures from both sides.
Absolutely. More recently, we talk about the Global South. It really shows how the labels themselves track the changing global power landscape and the perceptions of these nations.
So the labels tell a story, too.
They really do. What's fascinating here is that even the very early attempts at formal development initiatives weren't purely altruistic endeavors. The book points to things like the British Colonial Development Act of 1929.
Okay, pre-war even.
Yeah. It did start focusing on smaller, more practical projects in the colonies. Water, electricity, public health, moving beyond just, grand infrastructure like railways.
But the critical insight here, you mentioned it wasn't purely altruistic.
Exactly. It explicitly had a dual purpose.
Yeah.
Yes, it was meant for colonial development, but it was also designed to stimulate the UK economy by boosting exports and reducing unemployment back home.
So helping them by helping ourselves, sort of thing.
Pretty much. That blend of aid for development and benefit for the donor has been a recurring theme throughout this whole history.
You see that again and again.
Absolutely. That duality is crucial. The League of Nations also got involved, looking into issues like the exploitation of colonial economies for raw materials, essentially questioning the trusteeship concept.
Which was supposed to be about preparing colonies for independence.
Right, theoretically.
Right.
Not just extracting resources.
And they examined public health and nutrition, too.
They did. The book mentions British surveys in the late 1930s revealing serious dietary deficiencies in the colonies. But this is where the limits became really clear.
How so?
Well, the major imperial powers, Britain and France, were dominant in the League, right? And they severely limited the League's ability to actually oversee their colonial practices. So international concern was there, but not really the power to enforce significant change.
Ah, okay. Power politics trumping ideals.
As often happens. Which brings us to a period where external shocks really forced the issue, the 1930s and the Great Depression.
A huge turning point globally.
Massive. This crisis hit primary exporting countries, especially in Latin America, incredibly hard. Their exports just collapsed.
The sources cite figures like, 30% to over 80% declines in export values for some nations between 28 and 33?
Yeah, imagine that. That kind of shock is devastating if your entire economy relies on exporting raw materials.
Unimaginable.
It was so devastating that it led to a profound shift in thinking in Latin America. It triggered a widespread rejection of the prevailing liberal economic policies, the sort of free market
So
ideas.
they ditched the old model.
Largely, yeah. And there was a strong push for governments to step in, to direct the economy more actively. This actually resonated with the U.S. New Deal's philosophy of activist government and the emerging Keynesian economic ideas.
Interesting parallel. So the global crisis created an opening for a completely different economic philosophy to gain traction.
Exactly. And the U.S. started taking a greater interest in Latin America, partly, driven by the growing German challenge in the region before the war, geopolitics again.
Always there in the background.
Always. They began supporting currency stabilization, debt restructuring, and even financing specific industrial projects, like Brazil's first big steel mill, Volta Redonda, through the Export-Import Bank.
So a mix of economic support and strategic interest.
Definitely. What's really striking, though, is a detail the book mentions about China during this same period. While most of the world economy was just cratering,
Shanghai was booming.
Shanghai was booming. Estimates suggest annual growth rates of over 11% in the early 1930s, a surprising pocket of intense growth amidst global depression.
Wow. That's counterintuitive, isn't it? A truly different experience.
It really is.
Okay, fast forward to post-WWII. The goal was to build a new global economic architecture at Bretton Woods. We got the IMF and the World Bank.
Right, the big two.
But the planned third pillar, an international trade organization via the Havana Charter, that failed, didn't it?
It did. The U.S. Congress didn't sign on, didn't ratify it, so that left the weaker General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, GATT, in its place.
Weaker how?
Well, less enforcement power, narrower scope. The U.S. did concede to including a chapter on economic development in the Havana Charter draft to address concerns from developing countries, acknowledging their specific needs, but the institution designed to enforce broader trade rules just didn't fully materialize.
Got it. And the World Bank itself, you mentioned earlier, initially it was really geared towards rebuilding Europe, right?
That was the priority. The sources highlight its reluctance to lend to developing countries unless private capital was completely unavailable on reasonable terms. It seemed to operate on a principle of trade, not aid.
Trade, not aid. Sounds a bit dismissive.
There was even an initial view in Washington that countries like those in Latin America already had enough domestic capital, provided it wasn't squandered. That was the term used.
Dishonored. Ouch.
Yeah. But the book points to a turning point. The bank's first comprehensive economic survey mission, sent to Colombia in 1949. Apparently, that experience was really transformative for the bank's understanding of development challenges and its lending strategy going forward.
So the bank started to evolve, slowly perhaps, but at the same time, newly independent nations were finding their voice.
A huge shift. The independence of giants like India and Pakistan gave developing countries significant weight at the UN. They weren't just recipients anymore. They were demanding a say.
And what were they demanding?
They actively pushed for a new UN agency, something like the proposed UNEDA, specifically to provide concessionary capital, essentially, aid with easier terms than standard loans.
It's like soft loans.
Exactly. They argued there was a huge capital shortage that the World Bank just wasn't addressing, focusing instead on Europe. And crucially, they strongly advocated for investment in heavy industry, believing that was the path to true economic transformation, not just exporting raw materials.
So you see this early tension emerging, the West emphasizing trade and limited capital flows versus the developing world demanding more aid and industrialization focused on heavy industry.
Precisely. And this really sets the stage for countries exploring alternatives to the Western model.
Like what kind of alternative?
Well, planning, for instance, became a central tool. Not necessarily Soviet-style total central control, mind you,
Okay.
but using planning as a framework for policy,
Yeah.
especially where markets were underdeveloped or seemed to be failing. You saw this in India's dirigist model, meaning the state took a leading, directing role in key industries.
As opposed to just letting the market decide everything.
Right. This was different from the indicative planning sometimes favored by the West, which was more about setting voluntary targets and guidance, often with the unspoken rule that it wasn't explicitly communist.
Gotcha. And socialist ideas were influential too.
Hugely influential on many leaders. India's Nehru, for example. He had been exposed to thinkers like George Bernard Shaw and Fabian socialism in England. He was interested in Soviet economic planning policies as a way to escape poverty, even if he wasn't embracing Soviet-style communism itself.
Looking for practical tools, maybe?
Seems like it. And then you have uniquely non-Western ideas bubbling up, like the Gandhian plan, proposed by S.N. Agarwal, a follower of Gandhi. This plan explicitly rejected simply copying Western models, advocating for an indigenous approach rooted in local conditions and values.
Fascinating. What about other regions, like the Arab world?
There, socialism often merged strongly with nationalism. Nasser's Egypt is a key example. They adopted what's often called state capitalism.
State capitalism. So state control, but within a capitalist framework.
Sort of. State ownership of major industries, significant state direction. They saw initial rapid growth, but then ran into serious problems. Balance of payments, crises, reserves drying up, and ultimately default.
And then the IMF stepped in.
Yep, leading to IMF intervention that required painful measures like devaluation. Egypt ended up heavily subsidizing basic goods to cushion the blow and became reliant on Soviet aid for investment and U.S. food for peace for wheat imports. A complex dependency.
It sounds like a difficult balancing act.
Very. Algeria also pursued a state capitalist path, focusing on heavy industry and controlling its hydrocarbon wealth, and it also saw high growth rates for a time. These cases highlight the potential, but also the significant challenges and vulnerabilities of this state-led approach.
And hovering over all of this was the Cold War, right?
Oh, absolutely. It cast a long shadow. The U.S., which initially seemed less focused on economic development in developing countries compared to rebuilding Europe, suddenly became much more interested as crises emerged around the Soviet Union's periphery.
Like where?
Iran in 1946, for example. There was a crisis involving Soviet troops, and U.S. pressure at the UN contributed to their withdrawal. Events like that made Washington realize these regions were strategically vital.
So development became a tool in the geopolitical struggle for influence.
Exactly. This dynamic led to many countries seeking a third way, trying to avoid alignment with either bloc. That's where the non-aligned movement gained traction, spearheaded by leaders like Nehru from India and Nasser from Egypt.
Trying to carve out some independence.
And the Soviet bloc actively courted these non-aligned nations, supporting decolonization movements and anti-imperialist rhetoric. Khrushchev's high-profile visits to countries like India, Burma, and Afghanistan in 1955 were part of this charm offensive, trying to build alliances based on shared anti-colonial sentiment.
So both sides were using aid and influence.
Definitely. And specific Cold War hotspots became, in a way, testing grounds for different approaches and interventions. In Iran, Prime Minister Mossadegh's nationalization of the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, the AIOC.
That was huge, wasn't it? Early 50s.
Yeah, early 50s. Driven by nationalist sentiment and real anger over perceived unfair royalties from the British, it became a major international flashpoint with lasting consequences for Iran's development path, ending in a US-UK-backed coup.
And Guatemala, too.
Guatemala is another key example. Jacobo Arbenz' reformist government, which he termed spiritual socialism, implemented land reforms that significantly affected U.S. interests, particularly the powerful United Fruit Company, UFCO.
UFCO, right.
And this was viewed by the U.S. through that intense Cold War lens as communist infiltrated, ultimately leading to a CIA-backed coup in 1954.
Shows how internal reforms could get caught up in superpower conflict.
Absolutely. But the U.S. also used development models as a form of counter-influence. They promoted these big, integrated river basin projects inspired by the Tennessee Valley Authority, the TVA model used in the U.S.
For regional development, right.
Exactly. They pushed similar ideas in places like the Mekong Delta in Southeast Asia, and even brokered the incredibly complex Indus Water Treaty between India and Pakistan. This was soft power showcasing a democratic, technically advanced approach to large-scale development.
Okay, so as we move into the 1960s and 70s, new ideas about how development should happen emerged, but also persistent challenges remained, right?
Yeah, absolutely. You had things like modernization theory becoming very influential, particularly in the U.S. Walt Rostow's The Stages of Economic Growth is maybe the best-known example.
What was the core idea there?
It basically framed development as a predictable linear path. Countries would follow these set stages, moving from a traditional society ultimately up to an age of high mass consumption like the U.S.
A very neat step-by-step model.
Very neat. Maybe too neat. Because at the same time, there were these urgent fundamental challenges on the ground. Post-war population growth, which was particularly rapid in developing countries, intensified those Malthusian fears, the idea that population would outstrip food supply.
The population bomb idea.
Exactly. These concerns were really prominent at UN population conferences in 54 and 65. And the reality of famine, caused by a complex mix of conflict, bad policy, natural disasters, economic problems, it remained a terrible specter.
A constant threat.
And this urgency, this fear, partly drove the U.S. push for the Green Revolution in agriculture, particularly in places like India and Pakistan.
Right, the high-yield seeds.
High-yield seeds, fertilizers, irrigation, the whole package. The core idea was to dramatically increase food production. It was presented as a technical solution to hunger, but like we discussed, it also had that geopolitical aim.
To counter fears that food shortages would fuel communist movements.
That was definitely part of the calculus. The sources even mention the U.S. using grain shipments, like PL-480 Food for Peace, as leverage to pressure India into adopting these Green Revolution strategies.
Wow. So it wasn't just a gift.
Not entirely. Now, it's credited with vastly increasing food production in many areas, and Norman Borlaug, a key figure, won the Nobel Peace Prize for it. So many see it as a major success.
But there were downsides, too.
There were criticisms, yeah. Increased dependence on external inputs like fertilizers and pesticides, potential environmental issues, questions about whether the benefits reached the poorest small farmers. It wasn't a simple fix.
And not everyone was buying into this Western-style industrial growth path anyway.
Right. Definitely not.
Yeah.
Thinkers offered some powerful critiques. Gunnar Myrdal's huge study, Asian Drama, based on years of fieldwork in India, argued that conventional economic models just completely ignored crucial non-economic factors. Social structures, political realities, cultural attitudes.
Looking beyond just the numbers.
Exactly. And then you had even more radical critiques like the 1972 Blueprint for Survival. This came out of the UK, linked to the early environmental movement.
What did it argue?
It argued that continuous industrial growth was environmentally unsustainable. Full stop. And it said it was immoral for developed nations to pursue it at the expense of the developing world, using up resources and polluting. It basically said developing countries couldn't and shouldn't follow the same path.
A fundamental challenge to the whole growth paradigm.
Absolutely. Around the same time, you have E.F. Schumacher's Small is Beautiful arguing for appropriate technology. Technology suited to local conditions and skills, not just the biggest and newest, and emphasizing human scale development.
Keep things manageable.
Yeah. And Leopold Kohr offered a fascinating, maybe overlooked argument that the sheer size of nations was a key problem. He believed smaller, more manageable political and economic units were inherently better for good governance, sustainable economics, and social cohesion. He thought giant nation-states were part of the problem.
Interesting. So deep critiques were emerging.
They were, challenging the very foundation of the dominant development thinking. And then came the massive economic upheaval of the 1970s, especially the oil price shock starting in '73.
The OPEC crisis.
Right. This wasn't just about higher gas prices for us. It triggered a massive transfer of wealth to the oil-exporting OPEC countries. This led to huge increases in government spending in those nations.
Trying to absorb all that new oil money.
Exactly. Though the impact varied. The book talks about high absorption countries like Iran and Iraq with larger populations and big industrial ambitions. They actually faced fiscal strains sooner than low absorption Gulf states like Saudi Arabia or Kuwait, which had smaller populations and could just accumulate vast financial reserves.
Differences even within OPEC.
Then in 1980, the Brandt Report came out. This was a high-profile commission looking at North-South relations.
What was its main message?
It offered a really stark assessment of the global situation. It detailed the scale of absolute poverty, estimating something like 40% of the population in the global south lived in it, and issued urgent calls for action from the wealthy north.
Like what kind of action?
Significant aid targeted at agrarian reform, establishing global grain reserves to prevent famine, trade policies that genuinely benefited the South, reducing military spending globally, and just massive transfers of resources. It really laid bare the interconnectedness of the world, but also the profound inequality.
A powerful call to action. But did it lead to action?
Well, the 1980s became defined by a different kind of crisis, the devastating debt crisis, particularly hitting Latin America hard.
Ah, yes. What triggered that?
A key factor, often highlighted, was the U.S. Federal Reserve under Paul Volcker drastically raising interest rates to combat high inflation in the U.S.
The Volcker shock.
Exactly. And the consequence was that borrowing costs for dollar-denominated debt, which many developing countries had taken on heavily in the free-flowing credit days of the 70s, just soared.
Making it impossible to repay.
Almost. Real interest rates went up to like 20% in some cases. Combine that with falling prices for their commodity exports, the things they sold to earn dollars, and it became an unbearable burden.
A perfect storm.
It really was. Capital flight from these countries was immense as anyone with money tried to get it out. And the commercial banks, who had been so eager to lend petrodollars in the 70s, suddenly got scared and cut off financing.
Leaving countries stranded.
Pretty much. They became completely reliant on official sources like the IMF and World Bank for emergency funds. And this crisis, this desperation, provided the backdrop for a really fundamental shift in global policy thinking.
How so? It opened the door for new ideas.
It created the conditions under which new, quite radical policy prescriptions could take hold. Think about Chile under Pinochet after the overthrow of Allende's socialist government.
Right, the military dictatorship.
Advised by the Chicago Boys, economists trained in free market principles at the University of Chicago, Chile pursued radical, market-oriented reforms, privatization, deregulation, opening up to trade.
A real laboratory for these ideas.
It was seen as such, yeah. And it drew a lot of international attention as a completely different model than the planning and state-led approaches that had dominated much of the post-war era. It started influencing thinking in the West, notably leaders like Margaret Thatcher in the UK and Ronald Reagan in the US.
So Chile was a precursor.
In many ways. And Turkey, facing its own severe economic turmoil around the same time, also began shifting towards market reforms under Turgut Özal, aligning with the types of policies that would soon become globally dominant.
Which brings us, I guess, to the era where the collapse of the Soviet bloc seemed to remove the main ideological alternative.
Right, the end of the Cold War changes everything.
Cementing what became known as the Washington Consensus as the dominant global paradigm.
Exactly, the Washington Consensus. It wasn't an official treaty, more a shorthand for a package of market-oriented reforms strongly promoted by the IMF, the World Bank, and the U.S. Treasury, hence the Washington part.
And what were its core principles?
Basically, fiscal discipline, meaning governments shouldn't spend more than they take in, privatization of state-owned enterprises, trade liberalization, opening borders to imports, deregulation, cutting red tape, and generally a reduced role for the state in the economy. Let the market lead.
And countries needing financial help, say from the IMF.
They pretty much had to adopt these structural adjustment programs, as they were called. It was often a condition for getting loans.
But the initial results weren't always positive, were they?
No, the sources point out that those early structural adjustment programs in the 1980s, while maybe helping stabilize balance of payments in the short term, often had negative effects on economic growth and poverty rates. The medicine was sometimes very harsh.
And the overall data from this period, looking at the gap between rich and poor countries.
It's pretty stark. The income gap between the developed OECD countries and most of the developing world actually grew significantly between the 1970s and the 1990s.
Grew despite all the development efforts.
Grew wider. Latin America's per capita income fell relative to the OECD average. Africa's relative income basically halved. The Middle East and North Africa also saw relative declines after the oil boom peaked.
So convergence wasn't happening for most.
Not really. The only major exception showing sustained relative growth during that period was East Asia. We'll come back to them.
Okay. And meanwhile, the post-Soviet era brought other challenges.
Yeah, in many parts of the world, especially where states were weak or collapsing, you saw state authority seriously challenged by powerful non-state actors.
Like who?
Separatist movements, criminal gangs, warlords. This was fueled partly by the flood of weapons onto the market after the Cold War ended and the rise of global narco-trafficking.
Undermining the state itself.
Exactly. Weakening already fragile institutions and often exacerbating cronyism and corruption, and the shock therapy approach to transition to many former Soviet republics.
Rapid liberalization, privatization.
Yeah, trying to switch to capitalism overnight, it often led to disastrous short to medium-term economic outcomes. Huge drops in GDP, hyperinflation, massive inequality. Many of those countries didn't regain their 1989 GDP levels for a decade or even more.
A painful transition.
Very painful for ordinary people.
But as you mentioned, there was that counter-narrative, the East Asian miracle. How did it succeed when so many others struggled?
It's a really important contrast. Their success was often explained using Akamatsu's flying geese model, the idea that economies in the region follow a leader, like Japan initially, moving up the industrial value chain in sequence.
So one country masters textiles, then moves to electronics, and the next country follows into textiles.
Kind of like that, yeah. But crucially, countries like Taiwan and South Korea didn't just adopt pure free markets like the Washington Consensus preached.
They did something different?
Very different. They used sophisticated, highly interventionist state policies. The state actively nurtured specific industries, directed credit from banks to favored sectors, and linked incentives like subsidies or access to foreign currency directly to export performance. If you didn't meet export targets, you lost support.
So a very guided form of capitalism.
Very guided. Taiwan also benefited from successful early land reform, which created a more equitable base and boosted agriculture. South Korea under Park Chung-hee used these powerful state-guided conglomerates, the chaebols, like Samsung, Hyundai.
Old names now.
Right. The state worked closely with them, pushing them to export. And they benefited massively from regional dynamics and events like the Vietnam War, which created huge demand.
And China's reforms under Deng Xiaoping, also different.
Also different, more cautious, gradual, experimental, but crucially, Deng linked the legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party explicitly to delivering tangible economic results, improving living standards for the population. Performance legitimacy, these were very different paths than the standard Washington consensus prescription.
Showing there wasn't just one way.
Absolutely. This era also saw a new wave of globalization really accelerate, linking markets, finance, and supply chains globally like never before. Technology like container shipping and the internet played a huge role.
But this globalization quickly faced significant backlash, didn't it?
It did, from various quarters. Critics, particularly from the left, but not only, saw it as a new form of Western, especially American, hegemony.
Imposing its model on everyone else.
That was the argument. Also, concerns about a loss of national sovereignty to unaccountable multinational corporations and international institutions like the WTO or IMF. And fears about it promoting a homogenized global culture, McDonald's everywhere, at the expense of local diversity.
The anti-globalization movement became quite visible.
It did. And the 1997 Asian financial crisis starkly exposed the vulnerabilities of this newly globalized financial system.
What went wrong there?
A combination of factors.
Sure.
Huge, unstable flows of short-term capital, hot money, into these booming Asian economies, poor financial regulation in those countries, crony capitalism, and what economists call moral hazard.
Moral hazard.
Yeah, the idea that banks and investors took excessive risks because they assumed that if things went wrong, their governments or the IMF would bail them out so they wouldn't bear the full consequences of failure.
So the safety net encouraged risky behavior.
That's the theory. And when the crisis hit, currencies collapsing, bankruptcies, soaring leaders like Malaysia's Prime Minister Mahathir Mohamad were very vocal. He fiercely criticized international speculators like George Soros and the stringent sovereignty-limiting conditions the IMF imposed as part of its bailout packages.
A real challenge to the system.
A major challenge.
Yeah.
Moving into the 21st century, some new dynamics gained prominence. One is migration and the resulting remittances.
Money sent home by workers abroad.
Exactly. For many developing countries, this became a critical, often underestimated source of foreign exchange, the hard currency they need to pay for imports. In many cases, remittances now exceed official development aid or even foreign direct investment.
Wow, more important than aid or investment.
For a significant number of countries, yes. It's a huge flow of money, often going directly to families. And informal finance systems like Hawala, which are ancient trust-based networks, often used for remittances.
They got more attention too.
They did, particularly after 9/11, because of concerns about their potential for illicit uses like money laundering or terrorist financing. It highlighted how these informal networks operate within and alongside the formal global financial system.
Interesting intersection. What about the early 2000s?
That period saw a significant emerging markets boom. Countries like the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and others saw strong growth.
What drove that?
Various factors. High commodity prices helped some, high domestic savings rates in Asia, large current account surpluses, and significant capital inflows into these economies. This actually provided them with a degree of resilience when the 2007-08 global financial crisis hit the developed world so hard.
So they weathered that storm better.
Generally, yes. Growth rates in many emerging markets significantly outpaced the developed countries during this period. It really fueled talk about a possible shift in global economic power dynamics away from the traditional centers.
A changing world order.
Potentially. However, despite these successes and this long history of theories and interventions we've been discussing, the whole concept of development itself became more fractured, more questioned.
How so?
Well, you started seeing the rise of post-development theories. These weren't just critiques. They fundamentally questioned the entire development project as inherently flawed,
Flawed in what way?
arguing it was based on Western assumptions, that it had largely failed to genuinely reduce poverty for the poorest, and that it brought major negative consequences like environmental destruction and cultural disruption. Basically, questioning if development, as conceived, was even desirable.
A radical critique.
Very radical. Even mainstream initiatives like the UN's Millennium Development Goals, the MDGs, launched in 2000,
Yeah.
while they definitely raised awareness about global poverty, health,
They
education,
are criticized too.
they were criticized for being perhaps too broad, difficult to measure accurately, and lacking clear causal links, showing that the goals themselves actually caused development to accelerate on the ground. Did countries improve because of the MDGs, or would they have improved anyway? Hard to tell.
Measurement and causality problems.
Exactly. And more recently, say in the last decade or so, the world has seen a worrying resurgence of authoritarianism in many places.
Democratic rollback.
Seems like it.
Hmm?
This is influenced by a mix of factors. The failures of some democratic transitions after the Cold War, military forces reasserting power in some countries, the appeal of the perceived stability and economic success of China's state-centric model.
The China model becoming attractive.
For some leaders, yes. And even echoes of Western populism undermining democratic norms and institutions globally. The book notes how democratic processes can be manipulated or hollowed out, even in long-established democracies like India under recent governments.
A global trend, then.
It appears so. In Latin America, specifically, populism has made a significant comeback.
Why there?
Often rooted in the region's deep-seated inequality, economic, social, ethnic, racial divides. And fueled by public frustration with austerity measures and weak economic growth following earlier crises.
A reaction against the previous consensus.
Often, yeah. These populist movements frequently prioritize redistribution of wealth and renewed state intervention in the economy. Sometimes it's encapsulated as the 3 Rs: redistribution, reactivation of the economy through state spending, and restructuring institutions.
A different approach again.
Definitely. And another tool that's become prominent in recent geopolitics is the use of economic sanctions.
Financial warfare, almost.
You could call it that. Primarily wielded by powerful states, especially the U.S., leveraging its dominance over the global financial system, the dollar, SWIFT, etc. These sanctions can inflict severe economic pain on targeted regimes and countries.
Like with Iran.
Iran is a prime example. The U.S. financial embargo imposed around 2012 significantly contracted its economy, cut it off from global finance. It shows the power projection possible through controlling financial networks.
A modern form of coercion.
Absolutely. And even in countries that have seen impressive headline GDP growth, like India, since its market reforms in the 1990s.
The narrative there is often very positive.
It is. But the book cautions that underlying challenges persist. Things like poor infrastructure holding back potential, relatively low scores on human development indices like health and education compared to economic tiers, and potential vulnerabilities like slowing productivity growth that could hinder progress in the future. It's not always a simple success story.
Nuance is needed.
Always. And ultimately, as the sources vividly underscore throughout this history, global inequality remains maybe the defining feature of our world.
It hasn't gone away.
Far from it. Research cited in the book shows that the vast majority of wealth and income gains globally since the 1990s have accrued to the very top percentage of the global population, the richest 1%.
While the poorest.
The poorest half of the world's population has seen minimal gains in their share of global income or wealth. The gap is enormous. And regions like the Middle East and North Africa are highlighted as now being the most unequal regions globally in terms of income distribution within countries.
That's a sobering reality.
It is. And thinkers like Emanuel Wallerstein, with his world systems analysis, offer a broader framework to maybe understand this persistence.
What's his core idea?
He argues that the proper unit of analysis isn't just the individual nation-state reacting to global forces. Instead, we should look at the global world economy itself as a single integrated system.
The whole world is one system.
Essentially, yes. A system with a core, rich countries, a periphery, poor countries, and the semi-periphery in between. He sees economic, social, and political factors as deeply interdependent across this global structure. From this perspective, the struggle to escape poverty isn't just an internal national issue, but fundamentally shaped by a country's position within this unequal global system.
So the structure itself perpetuates inequality.
That's a key part of the argument. It really reinforces the idea that national development paths are always navigating a complex and often profoundly unequal international context. You can't just look at countries in isolation.
Right. It's all connected.
Deeply.
Okay. So as we wrap up this deep dive into L.A. Larry's Rich World, Poor World, Wow, we've journeyed through a history marked by constantly shifting language just to describe global disparities.
From backward to global south.
Exactly. We've witnessed the clash of competing theories about how countries actually develop, seen how unexpected global crises like the Depression or the debt crisis forced dramatic changes in direction, and really grappled with the evolution of the global economic order itself.
What really stands out, I think, is just how complex this history is. There's clearly no single, simple path to development, no magic formula.
Doesn't seem like it.
The journey for so many countries has been defined by missed opportunities, powerful external pressures, geopolitical, economic, ideological, and this persistent, often increasing challenge of inequality, both within nations and between them.
We've covered so much ground, from the questionable duality of early colonial aid and the limited reach of early international bodies.
Right, the League of Nations.
To socialist experiments that ran into crises, Cold War powers using development as a tool in their rivalry, the huge impact of technological shifts like the Green Revolution.
And the powerful critiques challenging the very idea of endless growth from thinkers like Myrtle or Schumacher.
Exactly. The uneven experiences with state capitalism, the unique interventionist path of the East Asian tigers that defied the standard model.
The backlash against globalization, the complex realities of remittances becoming so vital, the resurgence of authoritarianism we're seeing now, and the wielding of financial power through sanctions. It's a lot.
It really is. It's a history of continuous struggle and adaptation, it seems. This whole deep dive raises a crucial question, I think, for you, the listener, to consider. Given this long, intricate, often frustrating history of attempts to overcome global poverty and inequality, a history filled with both brilliant insights and, let's be honest, spectacular failures. What fundamental lessons do you think we collectively have learned? Or perhaps, more importantly, what lessons have we failed to learn about how to truly build a more equitable and prosperous world for everyone?
That's the multi-trillion-dollar question, isn't it? What have we really learned?